Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar on demystifying fire specification. I'm Martin Hilditch, Managing Editor of Inside Housing magazine, and today's session in association with Rockwool couldn't be about a more important issue. Thank you all so much for tuning in. In a moment I'll be introducing our fantastic panelists, but first a bit of background about the ground we'll be covering. We're hoping to have a quite practically focused session looking at what landlords need to know and what should guide their thinking when it comes to the safety of buildings that they are responsible for. Sadly, we all know why this is such an important agenda. The Grenfell Tower tragedy exposed numerous systemic and individual failings that cost 72 lives. It highlighted vital questions about how we make sure buildings are safe throughout development and repairs and maintenance work. I say it highlighted questions because frankly there were serious problems that had become obvious following other major fires, such as 2009's Lakanal house blaze in which 6 people died. It's a scandal that more central action wasn't taken before the Grenfell tragedy. And that really takes us on to today's session, which is, with the inquiry into Grenfell currently ongoing, there's a danger that landlords sit back and wait for the outcomes. However, there's lots of existing learning that they should be picking up on and that should inform their thinking moving forward. And that's really what we'll be looking at today. We want to help clarify responsibilities and provide food for thought for listeners that will help them do their jobs better and ultimately make our housing stock safer. We'll be touching on the classification of building materials, the regulatory regime and the right questions to ask at the design stage. We'll be hearing from our panel in a few moments, but first a bit of housekeeping. This session is as much about the audience as our panelists. This is your chance to ask the experts questions that will help you clarify your own approach and thinking. So please use the question box, which should be on the right-hand side of the screen, to post any queries you have during the session. Our panelists will direct the questions to our panelists, and they'll be able to type answers directly to individuals throughout, and I'll be picking up on as many of those questions as possible after the presentations in a question and answer session. So we'll get through as many questions as we possibly can today, and hopefully make this as practical a session as possible for everybody who's attending. Right, so without further ado, it's time to introduce our panelists. We're kicking off with Robert Sneesby, Health and Safety Manager at Saffron Housing, who is also representing the National Social Housing Fire Strategy Group today. Then we'll be hearing from Tim Vincent, Head of Technical at Rockwool. And last but not least, we'll be getting the thoughts of Howard Passy, Principal Consultant at the Fire Protection Association. So an absolutely fantastic panel lined up today. Lots of expertise, yeah, like I say, please do ask questions throughout to all our panelists, because again, other than when they're presenting, they'll have an opportunity to get back and answer as many questions as they possibly can. So yeah, that's the format. Those are our panelists, and yeah, I think that's more than enough from me, and that's hopefully set the background for people. Yeah, Robert, it's over to you.
That's fine. Thank you, Martin. Just that little bit. Actually, Martin's introduced me already. My name's Rob Sneesby. I work for Saffron Housing Trust. We're about 10 miles south of Norwich, just to put you as to where I'm speaking from. But today I'm representing the National Social Housing Fire Strategy Group. And if you're not aware of what the group does, then do look us up on the internet, because we represent around 3 million properties in the social housing sector across Britain. So please do look us up. You should now be seeing the first slide headed up, how do fire safety classifications operate? In the first part of this webinar, I want to look a little bit at how the client, that's the person or the organisation who's having a building constructed, can influence the fire safety performance of the finished building. So the primary set of regulations we need to think about are the Construction, Design and Management Regulations 2015. In doing that, we're going to look at the importance of preparing a client brief at the very early stages of sort of buildings design and actually planning what you want from the building, and how the inclusion of a fire evacuation strategy at that stage can impact on how the designer designs in the fire safety precautions. So that will need us to look a little bit at a very small part of approved document B, building regulations, which looks at the classification of materials. And then just a little bit at the end, we'll look at how the client can positively work with the design team to make sure that we get the building outcomes that they want. Okay, so the client has overall responsibility for the successful management of the project. That is a statutory role placed upon you by the construction design and management regulations, and in doing so you need to appoint a principal designer and a principal contractor whenever you've got more than one contractor involved with the project. If you don't make these appointments in writing, the regulations assume that you're going to be carrying out those duties yourself, so you do need to make sure you make those appointments in writing. And one way to help explain what you want from the finished building, as well as making sure that you carry out those duties under CDM 2015, is to develop a client brief. And if you do this at an early stage, this will influence how your designers and how your builder can accommodate the requirements that you wanted from the building you're proposing to build. So the brief should include, from a fire safety perspective, the main function and the operational requirements of the building, such as who's going to live there or work there, how many people will be in the building, and whether they can leave the building unaided or will they need assistance to leave the building. This will enable us to help thinking about the fire strategy for the building. And really what I'm thinking about at this stage is what you want people to do if the fire alarm goes or if a fire starts. And there's really kind of three opportunities that we have. We can either go for simultaneous evacuation. Simply that means that if the fire alarm goes or if there's a sign of fire or smoke anywhere in the building, everybody gets out. We might, particularly for a larger building, sort of a sheltered housing complex or an extra care building, we might want to have that phased and just actually get the people who are really impacted by the fire or smoke out of the building and leave the rest where they are, because provided the building is designed to be safe to contain fire, it's safer to leave them where they are, much better, particularly where people are more vulnerable. And then the last one is stay put, which is really for general needs flats blocks, where we have a fire resisting box principle. And the idea is that the compartment should keep those people safe, provided that's not the fire where the flat is. So it's getting to that sort of fire strategy as to how we're going to design the building, really. And then if we move on to building regulations approved document B, there's about 400 pages of this, but we're only going to look at the bits that look at maintaining and controlling internal fire spread and external fire spread. So if we look at internal fire spread, ADB makes requirements to control it through four elements. It's the load-bearing elements of the structure, then how it's compartmented, any concealed spaces and cavities, and then specifically today we're going to talk a little bit about the wall and ceiling linings. And the requirement is that the materials used to line the inside walls and ceilings of a building and any other parts of the internal structure are able to adequately resist the spread of flame, and if they do become ignited, that the rate of heat release and fire growth is reasonable. The provisions do not apply to the surfaces of floors or stairs, because the assumption is that those elements of the building are not going to be involved in the early stages of a fire. The fire will be well alight before they become involved. So we have here a diagram, table 10 and table 8 from approved document B. And what this is saying is that there are different classifications of linings that you can use in different parts of the building and for different building types as well. For example, the linings of the hallway within a domestic dwelling, a flat, must be National Glass 1. So that would include things like wallpaper. But the common escapeways, the bits out of the building of a sheltered housing block or a block of flats, they have to have Class 0. And Class 0 is the highest classification of building materials that are used in that sort of situation. And it means brickwork, cement blocks, anything cement-based, which has good properties in fire. Plasterboards, ceramic tiles, and it also can include composite materials that have been tested in accordance with BS 476 and meet a standard which says it's either non-combustible or either limited combustible. But if you think about a general needs flats block or a shelter block, the ideal is that it's brick or block or plasterboard lined or something like that, something which has a very good property for not promoting fire spread. It's taken a while to turn the page over. Okay, so we then move on to external fire spread. We're going to look at construction of the external walls. ADB also looks at the space separation and the roof coverings. And there we have. I hope you can see those diagrams reasonably well, but I'm going to talk you through them. The requirement is that the external walls shall adequately resist the spread of fire over the walls and from one building to another. So we have to look at where the building is sited, and it has regard to the height of the building, the use of the building, and the position of it. So on the right-hand side at the very top, we're talking about assembly places and recreation, which have different requirements. So we'll just think about the other four steps today. So if you look in the center top example, so this is a building, a flats block, and it's less than 18 meters tall. It's not a place of assembly or recreation, and it's greater than 1 meter from any relevant boundary. And for the purpose of this, let's say a relevant boundary is another building. In that case, there are no requirements in respect of the external construction of the building. If we then look at the bottom left example, so this is a building taller than 18 meters and with a relevant boundary that is closer than 1 meter, then the external construction must be Class O. So that again, that means brick, concrete, that sort of thing. The grey area, and it is a bit of a grey area, particularly at the moment, is the centre middle diagram, because this is a building that is greater than 18 meters tall, but is also greater than 1 meter from another building. And in this case, materials that can be used for parts of the structure or parts of the external construction can be used if they pass combustibility tests in accordance with BS 476. This is the materials of limited combustibility that we've been hearing a great deal about over the last couple of years. What is important is that for all, when you're designing buildings or having a design put forward, that you work with your designers to ensure that the right materials are specified, and also to be aware at the moment that there are changes to this part of building regulations which may be introduced following the Hackett report and ultimately the outcome of the Grenfell Tower as well. So we can't just look at external spread in itself. We have to actually look at where the building is and how tall it is and how close it is to other buildings. So this is just sort of a summary slide, really. As a client and the housing association having a property built is the client, should start to prepare a client brief at the very start of planning of the building. The brief can then be used to initiate discussion with your architect and your design teams to determine the best fire strategy for the building, whether we tell people to stay put or whether we want them to get out of the building. And in doing that, the designers can decide in how many escape routes we need, where they need to be, how many, or the type of fire alarm detection system that needs to be in the building, and also the actual materials that can be used to construct it, which is the main thing we're talking about today. You must ensure that enough time is allowed for work to do, the design work and the construction work. If we compress time because we've got targets that are slipping in other ways, whenever time's compressed, obviously errors are more likely to happen. And set realistic budgets. There's not much that a builder can cut costs on other than labour and materials. And we really don't want them cutting materials or labour. We want well-trained people fitting the stuff together, and we want to make sure they're using the stuff of the right specification. And then finally, just beware the design and build contracts. This is hugely used in social housing. But under this type of contract, the principal contractor takes on design duties during the construction phase. So if the contractor wants to save money, an easy way to do that is by using cheaper materials. So you need to make sure that there is a contractual agreement on the standards of materials that the contractor can use, and a way of handling any design changes that might be needed through the process. So there is a process where a contractor must escalate these through the design team and through the client, so that those design changes are approved and not just carried forth at the contractor's sort of will. So that's where sort of I'm coming from today. It's really looking at the client's role. I think at this stage, I can hand you back to Martin.
Thank you very much. Lots to pick up on there, lots of questions around design and build, preparing a client brief, and questions we can pick up on as we move to that question and answer session later on. Lots of people tuning in at the minute, not so many questions, so please, I mean, obviously lots of learning from the panelists and lots of learning from presentations. but do take that opportunity to start preparing questions for the panelists as we go along, and we can start directing them to the right people as we move along. Right, thank you very much, Robert. Next up, we've got Tim Vincent, Head of Technical at Rockwell. Tim, it's over to you.
Yes, I'm Tim Vincent. I'm Head of Technical at Rockwell. We are a global producer of non-combustible stone wool insulation. We have manufacturing facilities in South Wales and operate throughout the UK as well as globally. I think this presentation actually builds on quite well from what Robert talked us through, because he looked at BS476 and Class O, which originally came in for internal linings, as he said. However, the world has since moved into harmonised European standards and a Euroclass rating scale for construction, particularly thermal insulation products, which is what this short presentation will attempt to take you through. Quick bit about fire, really. There's a fire triangle, which you may well have seen, that we always talk about. There are three things that you need to have a fire. You need to have fuel. Without a fuel source, there is nothing for a fire to use to ultimately develop. Heat, you have to have heat in place. Without the heat, you won't get the ignition of the fuel source. And how do you get the ignition? Well, that's where you need the oxygen. Oxygen, which will ultimately ignite the fire. And if you remove one of the elements within this triangle, then you will not get a fire. If you were to use non-combustible products throughout the building, for example, then that is the fuel that would be ultimately removed. You may still have the heat from a potential fire source, be it externally, and you will obviously still have the oxygen. However, the fuel will be either greatly suppressed or removed by using non-combustible solutions. So understanding the product's combustibility, or indeed non-combustibility, to look at it a different way. BS476 has already been discussed. Part 6 and 7 test has been out for quite some time, which will ultimately look at creating Class O, which is a well-known product classification out there. BS476 also classifies a product as non-combustible, going through other tests. However, in 2013, with harmonised European standard as a result of CE marking that came in, EN 13501 Part 1, this then creates a Euroclass scale to rate a product as non-combustible, if you look at the table on the right, which would be classified as A1. A product of limited combustibility, which means it does not help to grow a fire, would be A2. And if there's anybody listening here from Scotland, A2 in Scotland is actually also non-combustible. The non-combustible and limited combustibility terms are an England and Wales thing. In Scotland, A1 and A2 are both classified as non-combustible. And then we go from B down to F, and these are combustible products as they're rated. And finally, you do have an MPD, which is no performance determined. It was either not tested, or ultimately it was not able to give it actually a classification. So these are specifically reaction to fire tests. So what does the reaction fire test actually look at? It looks at the ignitability of the product. So there are 5 tests it goes through. So it looks at the potential for the product to ignite, the flame spread over the product, the heat emission, the smoke and toxic gas emissions that the product will give off during its burning, or its not burning, obviously, depending on which end of the scale we are looking at here. And any character changes, i.e. melting, dripping or charring of the product. That is obviously highly valuable information, particularly for the fire service or those kind of things when they are trying to fight fires with products. You don't want melting, dripping or charring from these products, and that is a key characteristic of rating it on the Euroclass scale. So only materials that are A1 can be classified as non-combustible, or A2 for limited combustibility. Everything else is classified as a combustible product. So how do you find this out? It's all well and good for me to talk about it, but where is this actually declared? For thermal insulation products particularly, it's mandatory that this is declared in a declaration of performance certificate that all manufacturers legally have to produce. The vast majority of manufacturers will put these loud and proud, so to speak, on the website where you can find them. Some manufacturers you may have to go and ask. However, this is something that has to be put on them, available for every particular product that they produce in this sphere. So example of our certificate, it's a generally standard template. However, each manufacturer would obviously slightly do it slightly differently. I don't expect you to see that. So if I can just blow up the little window in the middle, this is the key point you're looking at. So reaction to fire Euroclass characteristics, it will say here that this is for one of our products, it is A1, which means it is non-combustible, and so on and so forth. If it was B, C, D, or E, then you would know that you are potentially installing, specifying, or already have a combustible product on your building. So Class O. Class O, there's been a lot of marketing around Class O. What is it? It looks at the surface spread of flame of a particular product. The table is just instantly shot up here. Class O is often believed to be a look at whether a product is combustible or non-combustible or not. It is not. It purely looks at the surface spread of flame, so the ability of that product to spread flames across its surface and ultimately across a wider area. So it does not look at the ignitability as Euroclass does. It doesn't look at the heat emission of the product. It doesn't take into account the smoke and toxic gas emissions of the product. And if we think back to the awful events and what we see in terms of reports of last year, the smoke and toxic gas played a key part here. Character changes, melting, dripping and charring are also not taken into account. The only thing it looks at is the flame spread. The other important thing with this is the scales are not comparable. So you can have a product that achieves a Class O surface spread of flame. So in this test, in effect, it is the highest rated. It's the highest rating they can achieve. However, when you then look at Euroclass, it is actually a C, which means it is combustible, or even lower down the scale. So even more combustible than sort of a B or a C. And that's a key point. I think Dame Judith, in her report, has talked a lot about the potential misleading marketing from a wide range of products on the market. And sometimes people will believe Class O is the non-combustible or combustible test, and this is definitely not the case, I'm afraid. Quick snapshot of Document B. Robert's already showed us some, but we're going over all ground. The external envelope of a building should not provide a medium for fire spread if it is likely to be a risk to health or safety. The use of combustible materials in the cladding system and extensive cavities may present such a risk in tall buildings. How would you go about mitigating this? Of course, I would say this: use products that are classified as non or limited combustibility, not products that are shown and tested and classified ultimately as combustible on the scales that we've seen. So if I take you to my conclusions, so understanding combustibility and how to determine it. These are the points that I'd like you ideally to take away. Euroclass A1 and A2 materials offer a lower risk option than anything else out there. Check the declaration of performance for a product's Euroclass rating. That is the manufacturer declared and ultimately test house and third-party checked way of declaring a product for its combustibility or non-combustibility. Incorporates non-combustibles in the design from the outset. It's far easier to design these products in if they go from the very beginning rather than trying to build it in later on. And utilize the linear route for compliance. This basically means using products of limited or non-combustibility. That then avoids you having to go down the route of testing via a large-scale testing method such as BS 8414, that certainly in our opinion is not realistic and does not replicate the real world. So thank you. That's it for me. I hope you all picked up something from that.
Thanks very much, Tim. Lots to pick up.
Thank you, Martin.
We've got questions now coming through on the panel, which we'll hopefully get some answers to. But I will be sending them to our panelists and asking our panelists the questions that are popping up. So do keep asking, and I'll get through as many as possible in the question and answer session after this as we possibly can. So yes, thanks very much, Tim. We'll pick up on some of the points raised there in a few moments. Now we're over to Howard Passy, Principal Consultant at the Fire Protection Association. So Howard, it's over to you now.
Lovely, thank you very much indeed, Martin. Good afternoon, everybody. The session I'd like to look at builds very much on what both Robert and Tim have had to say earlier this afternoon in terms of the approach we take to ensuring appropriate design decisions are taken, that we're using appropriate products and materials, but also building on that, looking at making sure we're using competent people. to do the work that we're proposing. Robert's covered issues associated with the CDM regulations and ensuring you have an effective client brief. And I'd like to talk about the need for positive decisions to be made at this point, which ensure that in the event of fire, the building has a degree of resilience, not just about ensuring life safety, but thinking beyond that, because as a client, you've got the opportunity to influence at that stage. And similarly, in terms of what Tim has also had to say, certainly with regard to issues associated with the combustibility of materials, we can make decisions which help to, I suppose, improve or reduce risk in that respect. The Grenfell incident focused our attention on a huge number of things. There's a catastrophic loss of life, extraordinary external fire spread, not just horizontally as we might anticipate, but also vertically. But following on from that and looking at some of the research and some of the work's been done since, there's some confusion over the legitimacy of the design of the building, the selection of materials, the advice that was provided to the client and those involved in the construction process and refurbishment process, the interpretation of regulations and the test and approval methods, and also the consequences of the stay put or defend in place policy, which clearly had some resulted in some issues in terms of the number of people who tragically lost their lives or were injured. In terms of building resilience, this is probably the first and maybe often the last lesson that we get in terms of understanding the need for resilience. The big bad wolf story. But like any story, it can be reviewed from a number of perspectives, certainly in terms of material choice. If you look at it from the insurer's perspective, the brick house clearly represents a far better insurance proposition for wolf protection policies than the straw or the stick-built buildings do, which is a passive solution to a resilience problem. Straw and stick homeowners could, I suppose, be armed. That would be an active solution, so that they keep the wolf from the door. But from the government's perspective, stick, straws and bricks are all appropriate materials for ensuring life safety from wolf risks, because none of the pigs died. So we can see that there's a bit of a dichotomy there between what we think we might be getting and what the government promotes and legislation promotes that we should have against what we think we might be getting in real terms. As we're aware, when we talk about approved document B, we talk about the regulatory reform fire safety order, we talk about the construction design and management regulations, we're talking about life safety measures principally. But anything over and above that which might be introduced to improve the survivability of the property or the services it provides is entirely voluntary. So when we're designing in accordance with the building regulations or trying to achieve the building regulation requirements through the application of approved document B, we're really only satisfying a life safety requirement. And it's interesting to note, if you look at what the company's house website says about the role of a managing director, it says very clearly that a managing director should act in the long-term interests of their stakeholders, investors and employees, which is really talking about resilience, but that tends to get overlooked, I think. It's worth noting that 80% of businesses affected by a major incident close within 18 months, and that comes from the London Prepared organisation. Just going to show that if we continue to design in the way that we are designing and build in the way we are building, a significant fire does have the potential to put businesses out of business very, very rapidly. But what are the changing risk factors? There are a number of them, really. Certainly in terms of the materials we're using, light timber frame, greater use of plastics, structural timber panels with an insulation material, often a quite combustible insulation material, which are all affecting the resilience and the safety of our buildings, despite what we may be able to achieve through complying with the approved document, because none of these premises would necessarily fall outside of that requirement and would all provide a premises which is safe for people to occupy in terms of life safety. But in the event of a significant incident, you're probably looking at significant destruction of the building. And if you look at, I suppose, our legislative history in a circle, we seem to be coming back to a place where we started, going back as far as 1666 and the Great Fire of London, and the legislation that was introduced then to stop the use of predominantly timber and to keep sensible distances between buildings. We're now moving right back round in a circle where we're seeing the greater introduction of these kinds of materials back into our construction environment and our built environment. In addition to materials, there are also issues associated with the design of buildings. Yes, so we're also changing the way we design buildings. We're using more modular buildings, and we're also providing different construction means and different construction methods, particularly in the way we access our buildings and in the way we ensure that they're heating and cooled, that do have significant implications for us. I have a little video here. I don't know whether this will work, but this was on the back of some investigative work into fires in timber frame buildings, where fire was found to have got into the void and caused a significant amount of damage. The eventual cause of the fire was noted to be cigarettes dropped into wood chip around the side of the building, and that was used just for decorative purposes. This ignited the plastic air brick and spread fire into the cavity. I'll just let this run for a few seconds, but I'm sure you'll pick up quite quickly what's actually going on. We recreated this problem in our laboratories, and we informed DCLG of the weakness. Their response was that at that time there were no plans to change building regulations at all, whereas we could clearly demonstrate that there was a significant issue and something that needed to be dealt with. There'll be a side view in a moment. You'll be able to see. Oh, I've moved it on. Anyway, the video goes on to show how fire has spread very, very quickly into the cavity itself and has started to attack the timber frame. On top of that, we also have issues associated with the energy systems that we're using. Not that they're a particular problem, but certainly that they introduce additional voids into the premises that may enable fire to spread. We might be meeting BREEAM design and environmental targets, but the likelihood is that we're weakening the fire safety and the resilience of our premises. So you'd think that in these circumstances and with the changed environment, the rules and regulations would be reasonably stringent. But again, another short video here I was just going to show you. But it's interesting to note in terms of cavity barriers, just how what we understand as being common behaviours, I suppose, in terms of protecting cavities behind rain screens. We've got a technical guidance here. We've got guidance here which says that technical failure of integrity and insulation would be deemed to have occurred at the start of the test due to flame passage through the open void. So where these intumescent products work, they can often allow a bit of time to operate and hence allow fire to spread between one side of the what should be the barrier and the other. The approved document B and the building regulations are about fire safety, not resilience. A quote from the building regulations is that they're intended to ensure a reasonable standard of life safety. They're not intended to ensure the resilience of the premises. There are alternative approaches to using approved document B and the prescription that it provides, and these are listed within the approved document B. One of the areas for concern, however, is the fire safety engineered approach, not because fire safety engineers can't be trusted, but very often fire safety engineering is used for very different purposes than that which we'd anticipate. Value engineering being the phrase of the moment. This is just a quote from the Hackett Review, where they repeatedly heard that common practices such as design and build contracts and value engineering can often result in uncontrolled, undocumented and poorly designed changes being made to the original design intent. And value engineering promotes the substitution of materials and methods with less expensive alternatives. So clearly something that we should be trying to avoid. I've got a couple of examples here as well of some information that I've taken off fire engineering consultancy websites, which just indicate that they even promote the fact that they can design premises where no sprinklers anywhere in the development, including the underground car park, reduce levels of compartmentation between the car park and levels above, reduction in fire-rated facades, allowing freedom to use larger areas of openable windows, reducing smoke ventilation, removing the need for sprinklers, reducing the periods of fire resistance, and reducing the level of smoke detection. So this is taken directly from other people's websites, not something I've made up, and you can just see how that's used. I just want to touch very quickly on responsibility before I shut up. In It's important to understand that within the regulatory reform fire safety order, there is a requirement on the responsible person to do various things. But the legislation goes on to say that where any person has, by virtue of any contract, tenancy, an obligation in relation to the maintenance or repair of the premises or the safety of the premises, that person can also be treated as somebody who has control, and hence somebody who can be held responsible when things don't go right. So making the right decisions at the design point is an important issue here in ensuring that you're ensuring the safety of the premises, the people in the premises, and protecting your own backsides in real terms. The requirements made there are reasonably similar to those in the CDM regulations. If you're involved in the provision, maintenance or management of fire safety at any level, then you share liability for its usefulness. It's not a duty of care or voluntary. It's very clearly a legal obligation and something that absolutely needs to be taken seriously. It's important also that you use the right people, and I think that's something that we need to reflect upon. I saw one of the questions that popped up earlier asking how can we ensure that a building that's already been designed meets our own objectives, and the best way of doing that is to appoint your own competent people to review the design and ensure that it achieves whatever it is you want it to achieve. I've just drawn a little diagram here which puts the fire safety specialist not necessarily at the centre of the entire project, although clearly from a fire safety perspective that will be the case. But they have a lot to coordinate, and it's important that you find the right competent people to help you in that role, because there are so many issues that they need to balance to ensure the safety of the premises and that you meet the client's design brief. And they clearly feed into what the principal designer does and what the client and owner might need. But ensuring competence is absolutely essential. Oh yeah, just a few bits of guidance just to show you how complex things are. In terms of purpose-built blocks of flats, difficulties in the application of legislation were solved by the production of guidance by the local government group. Hopefully the image of that document will appear in a few moments. The guidance is endorsed by government, the National Fire Chiefs Council and housing stakeholders as appropriate guidance to apply in relation to purpose-built blocks of flats, not only for the purpose of the fire safety order, but also to ensure the safety of residents within their own flats. And it goes on to say, as such, for purpose-built blocks of flats, the Local Government Association Guide supersedes the guidance on the left-hand side, the HM Government Guidance, with regard to sleeping accommodation. But then we also have the current National Fire Chiefs Council for Fire Safety and Specialised Housing, which also states that this guide supersedes the Local Government Association Guide in terms of safety in sheltered housing premises. So you really do need to find the right people to ensure that they understand these changes, they understand safety, they understand where to look for appropriate guidance, they go to look at clearly what the client design brief does, and they look at the properties of the materials that they're intending to use to make sure that you are going to achieve exactly what you want to do. So it's important that we use best practice guidance and standards. We use competent people because the legislative requirements are inexorably linked with that. We use products and people that are effectively certified, and trade association members wherever necessary. But just to reiterate really what I was saying at the start, we can make some good decisions at the start of a project in terms of what we want from the building, in terms of its resilience, not just in terms of life safety. And at that point, we can choose the right products. We can remove as much of the combustible materials as we possibly can. We can choose to build the building differently rather than timber frame, use masonry, for example, because that will all add to not just the life safety issues associated with the premises, but also its resilience in the event that there's a significant fire. And I anticipate I've spoken for too long, but that was my last slide, you'll be glad to hear, so I'll hand back to Martin.
Fantastic, thank you so much, Howard, and yeah, so much to get through there. We've had questions coming in, and we'll continue to assign questions to the panelists. I want to pick up on as many of those questions as possible, because we want this to be as practical a session for those tuning in as it possibly can be. So I'm going to start off by running through a few questions that have been asked as we've been going along, and as those presentations have taken place that have prompted various questions from the audience. So I'm going to start off with one of the questions that again has come in from the audience today. So yeah, the question is, when a developer brings a site to us that already has planning permission, how can we make sure that the fire strategy already developed by the architect meets our needs? So I guess this is a social landlord wanting to understand, what ability they have to get involved and specify. So who do you want to pick that up? I'll move perhaps to Robert first. Is this something that rings any bells with you?
Yes, can you actually hear me as well as typing?
I can hear you, Robert. Yes.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, I think that it's always an issue when we get a building, particularly Section 106, where we're building it, we're buying it when it's been really finishly built. But I think, as Tim was just saying at the end there, you've got to review the design, because the occupancy is very important to them. I think I did put that in a message. The occupancy in the building can't be viewed in separation. So you would have to need to go back and review the whether the design meets the occupancy you want. But there are other things we can do. I mean, we can think about fire detection systems and all that sort of good stuff. But if you get a block that was designed for general needs, that's going to be quite difficult to make it into an extra care block, I think. You really would need to go back and look at the design quite carefully.
Yes, thanks very much. Howard, same question to you, basically. Just again, I think this is the type of issue you hear quite a lot in the sector anyway. That what freedom do we have when there's developments perhaps that already have been built by other developers.
Sure. I think I tried to make reference to it briefly at the end of what I was saying there, and agreed absolutely with what Robert was saying in terms of reviewing the design yourselves. I think that it's important to understand that if somebody presents you with a design and planning permission for a particular type of premises, that the moment you take that on board, you're taking responsibility for it. So even in a legal sense, you can be held responsible if something within that design isn't correct. And so it'll be important for you to ensure that you review that design yourself and make sure it achieves exactly what you're expecting it to. And Robert's very clear as well. If you're looking to implement something that isn't a general needs block and you're provided with plans for that, then clearly it's going to be it's going to take quite some work to turn it around and turn it into something that is going to suit your needs specifically. But we see this problem not just in terms of existing or new build premises, but also in terms of where premises are refurbished, in understanding exactly what that refurbishment is going to achieve. Some of the examples that we've seen as an organisation, the overcladding of buildings being particularly prevalent, and particularly in the front of our minds following Grenfell, but some of those circumstances where the cladding's been installed over the front of balconies, so the balconies have suddenly become part of the internal area of the flat, without any real consideration being given to the standards of compartmentation between each of those balconies, which would ordinarily have been externally sited, and hence compartmentation not particularly an issue. But once they're inside the building, then it becomes very, very different indeed. So it's important, I think, that where those sorts of designs are presented to you, that as a client, you have your own advisors who are going to provide you with some real clarity over exactly what you're going to get, and can dig out any of those pitfalls and pratfalls that might exist.
I'll pick up on that point there, because Robert, I think you were talking earlier about preparing a client brief, and it kind of raises the question in terms of the sector itself, talking specifically about kind of social housing providers now. How good are they at preparing those briefs? What are the common mistakes? Basically, do they know what they want, really? How well organised are they? Robert, I'll come to you on that, and then I'll move to Tim, if that's okay. So Robert first, please.
That's absolutely fine. I think sometimes we're not as good as we ought to be. And I think sometimes, particularly when we're looking at what we would call specialist housing, which comes under the guide that Howard was talking there at the end, the new CIFO guide that came out last year, which covers everything from general needs right up to just below care homes. So it covers everything that a housing association does where it's supported. Sometimes when we're working with local authorities, they won't even know who the actual end users will be, but they know there's a need for that sort of a user group. But sometimes that really isn't enough, because you can end up with you can have a building where the support levels are going to be thought to be so high, say 25% upper wall, since you can't actually see me raise my hands up, but actually the support levels that the people need You know, they might be people who can't get out of bed when you didn't know that at the beginning. So that it's trying to get to the bottom of exactly how close the end user group is, because without the end user group, the architect is kind of designing to like a generic standard as opposed to designing for the actual people, which is always difficult to get to because these projects take such a long time. But the specialised housing guide that Howard mentioned it's a very wordy document, but it's a very, very good document in terms of for existing buildings as well, for people who are doing forest assessments. So I would go back to that one, especially when you're looking at designing a specialised housing block, and compare that with, use that and building regulations as your guide, particularly in terms of fit out, in terms of how you have different fire detection systems, which isn't really what we're talking about today, but different ways of making sure people are kept safe. But the design brief can be very difficult to really nail at the beginning, unless it's a very simple or a very generic type building. The more specialist it gets in terms of who might be living in it, there's more things that trip us up.
Thanks very much. And yeah, the really important issues raised there. Tim, if you'd like to pick up from that point, and a reminder of the original question about the types of client and how good the housing sector is at briefing. So what are you seeing in your experience there?
Was that one for me, Martin? I'm sorry, you cut out.
Yeah, sorry, yeah. So what are you seeing in your experience? How good is the sector as a client?
It's a difficult one for us because we don't always know the building type. Sometimes we just get questions for thermal values or those kind of things. The world has definitely changed for us since June of last year, where people are now taking more of an interest, whereas it's not so much an architect these days just phoning up or a distributor for an installer phoning up wanting a thermal value. We are now getting far more questions, giving us more information about the building regards to fire. I think the product you choose is key. So if you were to go down a non-combustible route to start with, and everyone would say, well, of course you'd say that, Tim, but you don't just get the fire benefits with it, you also get acoustic as well as thermal benefits. And whilst we're talking fire today, the world we live in at the moment, acoustics is a major issue. So if you look at specifying products that cover a whole range of things, it almost makes it far safer if that building at the end changes its use, or if there's different occupancy or something else gets built next to it. You've almost future-proofed it from the start, rather than designing it or thinking about or trying to work out what it's going to be on day one. If you get the product choice right at the very beginning, you can almost cover that building or get closer to cover that building throughout its use. But I think from our side, it's always ask the questions. As consumers of anything, you always have the right to demand. You might not get the answers you want, but I think if anything, we should be encouraged to ask more questions about the specification of what we're actually ultimately getting.
And I'll jump in there just in terms, because it brings us to another question that's been asked by our audience today. So in terms of you talking about asking the questions and making the demands, the question was, are we allowed to specify product type or material, or must we say only to certain standards? So how broad or how specific are you allowed to be if you're
I think, sorry.
Right, who's that going to?
So to Tim to carry on with, and then Howard, I'll move to you on that. Yeah. But Tim first.
Sure. At the end of the day, if you're paying for it, you have the right to ask for anything. In terms of we generally have far larger clients, and you people on the call may be representing such organizations, but we regularly do buildings for your Amazons, your Googles, those kind of things, and they always demand. In fact, they have their own standards that they will give their architect firm. It's no different lower down or for smaller volumes. You have a right to have that building as you would want it. So it's as early on as you can get it in. That is the issue, because if you need to substitute a product out, perhaps there won't necessarily be space, speed, height, width, all of those kind of things. These are considerations that need to be taken into account earlier on. And I think there's enough sort of noise about this at the moment now that whereas perhaps before you might have been told, don't worry, we'll do the design, it's fine, that actually, people will, you've got more chance of being listened to now.
Fantastic. And Howard, over to you with that question. So again,
yes, I'd absolutely agree with what Tim was saying. It's entirely up to the client to make those decisions. Clearly, there are cost implications of all the decisions, whether that's to increase the cost or reduce the cost. But I think at the end of the day, making the right decisions at the design stage in order to ensure the resilience of the building and some of those other benefits which Tim was mentioning also in terms of material choices can have a significant benefit further down the line. I'm just thinking in terms of the previous question that Robert and Tim answered, because making the wrong decisions in terms of if you don't understand what the building you've got is, or your building you're putting together, or the building you're being presented with is going to be used for, aren't necessarily always dealt with during the design or the build stage. There's something that then gets picked up during the risk assessment process, and at that point you suddenly find that the premises haven't been designed for the type of occupant that they may be hosting, and hence issues start to arise that are really quite significant in terms of the occupancy of the premises. And I think that at that point enforcement issues start to become slightly more likely, and something that needs to be guarded against.
Right, thank you very much. I'm going to whisk through a couple of questions because we've got about probably 6 or 7 minutes left. So I'll start with again from our audience. Our housing associations have appointed a local fire and rescue service as our primary authority to advise us on the fire strategies and building design. Sorry, another question just popped up there and that disappeared from the screen. Should we be asking them to comment on building materials as part of this? So who wants to jump in on that, if anybody? I will pick on you again, Howard, if that's right. Then.
Yeah.
So yeah. What's your thoughts about that? So housing association, the point of local fire and rescue services primary authority to advise us on fire strategies and building design. Should we be asking them to comment on building materials as part of this? Howard, have we lost you?
Hello.
Right, yeah, Howard, great.
Sorry, no, I absolutely think they should be. I think the primary authority arrangements, certainly those that I've engaged with have proved to be very beneficial to the associations that are using them and other organisations. But clearly it's a paid for service, so you want to get value for money. And fire and rescue services may not be able to offer you too much by way of advice in terms of material choices, but they'll certainly point you in the right direction and suggest that you speak to people who are competent to give you that advice. I don't think I've run across any that have particularly looked at that in detail in any of the engagements that I've had with them, but there's absolutely no reason why they wouldn't offer their own thoughts and views. Very often the primary authority representatives are from the fire safety side of the organisation, not the firefighting side. So you might get differences of opinions, but with a feed through of information, I think they'll understand that, if you're going to build out of something that isn't combustible or something that won't burn and drip flaming droplets in the event of a fire, they'd far rather you use those sorts of materials than anything else.
Right, I'm going to thanks very much for that, and I'm going to round off with another question from our audience. So thanks so much for everybody for writing in today. Hope we got through hopefully quite a lot of the questions. Apologies if we didn't get to yours, but yeah, clearly a really important issue, and that lots of questions have been flying in. I'm going to round off with a question that's perhaps looking forward and a bit of a wish list perhaps from our panel. So I'll move down the panel a minute or two each on this, so that then we can round off. So Robert, I'll start with you, Tim next, and then round off with Howard. So the question is, what changes in current legislation would you like to see as a minimum following Grenfell and other incidents? So yeah, this is your wish list for immediate action, I guess, or the top priority. So Robert, I'll start with you, and then we'll move down the panel.
Oh wow! I wish you'd given me a bit warning to a few minutes to answer to that one. A little bit of time. A wish list for this moving forward. I think if we look at the stuff we've had recently coming through, like the Hackett report, I think there's a lot of really good stuff in there. There's about 50 recommendations. And what Dame Judith has said all the way through is that not just looking at buildings of 10 stories or above, which is what her report kind of focuses on, is that we should look at other high-risk buildings. And I would think within social housing, this is like sheltered housing and extra care. And I think there's always been a view, before the tragic events at Grenfell, that the next significant fire was going to be probably in a sheltered housing block or some sort of supported housing, which is why CFOA were published the Specialised Housing Guide last year. So I think just to focus on the most vulnerable bits of our society, which are living in sheltered and extra care housing, and all the very specialised housing that we do, sort of care in the community now, which didn't even exist. That bit didn't even exist 10 years ago. So I think, just to maintain some focus on the most vulnerable people in society as well is actually quite important.
Great answer. Tim, same question to you. So, what changes in current legislation would you like to see? What's your kind of immediate wish list?
Sure, we've seen some noises from the select committee already. I mean, the Rockwell line for us is that products of non or limited combustibility on high rise only, which is something the government are consulting on at the moment. But it's wider than that. It's sensitive buildings, so care homes, sheltered housing, as Robert's already said, hospitals and schools. Those buildings of high occupancy with young, old, vulnerable, whatever stage of people in there, that they also need to be constructed using non or limited combustible materials. Digital technology can play a much greater part. I think moving forward, it gives a lot greater visibility to what is ultimately in your building and what the building might be constructed of. And I think that could mean that a lot of people who wouldn't necessarily have access to know what is in that building, she mentions references to building information modeling and those kind of things as we go forward. That makes the currently invisible, what's behind my wall, visible, or at least to the point where you can interrogate it. But it's a case of not using combustible materials in your buildings, particularly of sensitive nature, not just high rise.
Fantastic. And Howard, some last thoughts for you. So you get the last chance to change legislation. So what's on your immediate list? Howard, can you hear us?
I think I'd absolutely agree with what Tim and Robert have had to say in terms of extending the requirements that Hackett have suggested the government should take going forward to ensure that it's not just high-rise residential buildings that are being more carefully and more clearly looked at, and the use of combustible materials to be banned in such circumstances, but also other areas where people might be vulnerable, not necessarily vulnerable because of who they are, but vulnerable maybe because of where they are, in hospital or in hotels and these sorts of locations. So I'd like to see that to happen. I think on top of that, I'd like to see that we really have a way of ensuring the competency of all those involved in the process. And I know there are a series of working groups looking at that at the moment and developing competency criteria. And we already have competency criteria for fire risk assessors, but we need to think about how that's going to be implemented, because we can design the criteria really quite simply. What we need to be able to do is implement it effectively and in a way which everybody understands and which is clearly understood by the general public, as it were. And then lastly, slightly off piste, I suppose, but a return to using clerk of works. I'd like to see that. My background is in construction, and I was a site engineer, then a site foreman and a sub-agent for a number of years for a couple of contractors, and there was always a clerk of works, and they were always a pain in the backside. But you could absolutely guarantee that if you were changing something in terms of design or specification because it wouldn't work, they'd be all over it like a rash, and you'd absolutely know as a client, as somebody who's paying for the construction, that your best interests are being looked at the whole time that the building is being constructed, because they're there all day, every day.
Fantastic. So strong voices in the system, some clarity over rules and approaches, and I think all of the panel agreed that just we're talking about the people who are living in blocks themselves and their vulnerabilities. So yeah, lots of different issues to pick up on there, but some agreement between our panelists at the end. We've run out of time, unfortunately, even though there's a huge amount more we could actually discuss today. I think we could talk through the day if we wanted to. Thank you so much to our panel today. Absolutely great discussion and lots of questions we got through. And just a quick reminder that this is part of a series, and the next one's coming up on Thursday, November the 29th. So there'll be more information coming out to people who signed up, but look out for that moving forward. So yeah, thank you to all of our panelists today, and yeah, to Rockwell, and goodbye from me. Thanks.
It's been a pleasure. Cheerio.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.